Welcome back, class. In this lesson, we're going to be learning about the Pre Columbian civilizations. This means civilizations that existed in the Americas before the arrival of Columbus. Because these civilizations have been isolated from the rest of the world up until now, we haven't really talked about them yet, but that doesn't mean that America was a big empty land, the way it's often described when people sort of oversimplify when they're discussing the age of exploration. Ancient American civilizations followed similar patterns of development as civilizations over in the Eastern Hemisphere, sometimes referred to as the Old World. For example, here's one of those ziggurats, the pyramids that were common in Mesopotamia, and here's very similar looking step pyramids that were being built over in Mesoamerica. Late night shows on the History Channel will sometimes try to use this as evidence for alien involvement, but all it really means is that humans tend to build in pyramid shapes whenever trying to build large objects out of stone, because that's the most stable shape to build them in. What's actually important about these similarities is it demonstrates a similar level of advancement and organization in both of these regions. And there's going to be fully developed cultures spread all across the Americas before the arrival of European explorers. In fact, one of the largest of these civilizations is super nearby. It's a city known as Cahokia, which was the largest city north of Mexico and had a population of around 40,000 people before the year 700 CE. Cahokia is probably most famous for its large earthen mounds, which they would build to elevate some of the most important buildings in the village, symbolizing both their importance and helping to protect them from things like flooding and foreign attacks. This one's the largest of these mounds, known as Monk's Mound. It's about 100 feet high and about 17 acres large. You can see there's a little road right here that gives you a little bit of a sense of scale. And they did this without any large draft animals like horses or oxen to help them out. This entire thing was built up by hand using baskets of dirt and just piling them on top of each other. And when I say that this is relatively close by, it's only about 2 hours away. Cahokia can be found right outside of St. Louis. So once the epidemic's over, it might be an interesting site to check out. However, the really big civilizations can be found further south in Central and South America. Most of the civilizations up in North America remain hunter-gatherers for a long time because the land in this area is so rich with resources that people were perfectly capable of supporting themselves comfortably without having to resort to farming, which is a lot more labor than just hunter-gathering. It's in Central and South America that we see some of the really big cities being developed. In this area right here, often referred to as Mesoamerica, the first of these major civilizations is going to be a group known as the Olmecs, and they developed in the region that is modern-day Mexico. Like the early Old World civilizations that we learned about in Unit 1, the Olmecs learned how to farm, and they came up with a super effective farming method known as the Three Sisters method, where they'd grow 3 different crops, corn, beans, and squash, all in the same area because those 3 different crops help support each other and grow better. The corn provides support for the beans reintroduce an important nutrient, nitrogen, into the soil so it stays nice and fertile, and the squash provides ground cover to prevent the soil from drying out too much. It's honestly a really cool technique, and one I'm thinking of trying out in my new garden next summer. Another cool thing that the Olmecs had was rubber. Originally, rubber was actually harvested from trees. This is a photo of traditional rubber harvesting, and they were able to use this to make really cool things like rubber shoes. The rest of the world was using really uncomfortable sewn together boots, whereas the Olmecs were able to just dip their feet in pots of rubber, let it dry, and then have perfectly fitted custom-made shoes. They could use it for a lot of other things as well. It was a really neat resource. The Olmecs were clever in a lot of other ways too. For example, they invented their own writing system like most early civilizations, and they came up with a super advanced calendar. These calendars will be improved upon by later civilizations, most famously the Maya, which may be why this looks familiar to you guys. Again, keeping with the pattern of other early civilizations, they built large stone buildings, and they're probably most famous for building gigantic stone heads of important people within their societies. I like that most of the pictures of the Olmec stone heads available on the internet are people's vacation photos, so they always include like awkward tourists standing to the side, which give you a good sense of scale of just how massive these stone heads are. Another thing that makes the Olmecs kind of unique is their religion stressed the importance of sacrifice, often human sacrifice. One of the things they're famous for is the creation of this ball game that's kind of like a combination of soccer and basketball, where two competing teams try to bounce a ball and get it through the hoop, but they're not able to use their hands, so they're bouncing it off of like their hips and their knees. It sounds like an incredibly difficult game, especially because these balls are solid rubber, meaning they're super hard. If you've ever played with a lacrosse ball before, they're kind of like that, and some of those hoops were incredibly small. This game was incorporated into their religion in that at the end of the game, one of the teams would be sacrificed. And probably the most surprising thing is the team that would be sacrificed was usually the winning team. This is because they wanted to make sure that they were providing only the best sacrifices in order to keep the gods happy. This might lead you to think, well, then why don't the players just throw the game and intentionally lose? Well, being sacrificed could be considered a great honor. Also, I'm guessing that intentionally losing the game could get you into a lot of trouble. A lot of religious ceremonies also involved a lot of ritual shedding of blood, bloodletting, as a less lethal form of human sacrifice. Eventually, the Olmecs will go into decline and will be replaced with the Mayans. The Mayans are going to continue practicing and improving upon Olmec traditions, for example, expanding on their large stone buildings, and they're going to particularly get good at those calendars. The Mayans are famous for incredibly accurate astrological predictions. For example, if you remember the solar eclipse that happened a few years ago, the Mayans were able to predict when that would happen with a margin of error of only a minute or two. That's some pretty impressive calculation. This is also why, if you remember back in 2012, people were freaking out about, oh, the Mayans predicted the end of the world in 2012. The reason why people made such a big deal of that was the Mayans had a reputation for being so good at predicting astrological events. However, people who were predicting Mayan doomsday didn't really have a good understanding of the Mayan calendar. Like the Olmec calendar, it's circular, and the quote-unquote end of the world in 2012 was just when the Mayan calendar restarted. So it wasn't so much Mayan end of the world as Mayan New Year. Going along with these more advanced Mayan calendars, the Mayans also had a lot more written documents, or at least more of their documents survived than the Olmecs did, and so we're able to learn a little more detail about Mayan culture, and one thing people were particularly interested in were explanations for this religion that emphasized sacrifice so much. The short version of the story is, in the Mayan creation myth, the sun god sheds blood in order to give life to the world, and so humans, especially powerful and important humans, are also expected to shed blood to keep the sun god happy and sort of symbolically recreate that sacrifice. Because it was believed that people with higher status supposedly had more powerful blood, the importance of sacrifice was particularly emphasized among the elites. This is going to be a cultural tradition that is continued by our third and final Mesoamerican civilization, the Aztecs. The Aztecs rise to power in the region in 1400, so just before Columbus makes his famous voyage, and they're going to be the ones running the area when the Spanish explorers arrive. The Aztecs originally weren't a local people. They had lived further north and migrated downwards, and they even have a myth about how they came to this land. Supposedly, the Aztec people were wandering lost in the desert, and they were sent a message from their god that they would know that they had arrived in the chosen land when they saw a sign, and that sign would be an eagle swooping down to land on a cactus while eating a snake. Supposedly, the Aztec people see this sign when they're reaching this area right here, Lake Texcoco, and so that's where they decide to settle and build their capital. If the description of an eagle eating a snake while standing on a cactus sounds familiar, it's the symbol in the center of the Mexican flag, and the capital of Mexico, Mexico City, is in the exact same location that the Aztecs will build their capital city. And the Aztec capital is incredibly impressive. The city's name was Tenochtitlan, and while many other civilizations built their cities on the banks of a lake or a river, the Aztecs built Tenochtitlan in the middle of the lake. This is a floating city. This is an incredibly impressive feat of engineering, and some of the earliest Europeans to see the city describe it as being something out of a dream. In addition to being built on a lake, it had a fully functioning water and sewer system, including aqueducts bringing fresh water down from the mountains. The water in the lake could be a little brackish, a little too salty for drinking. They also used this water to create huge public bathhouses, and on average, the Aztec people bathed like twice a day. By comparison, the English queen, Queen Elizabeth I, was considered a huge neat freak in Europe because she bathed at least once every every month. Just imagine how stinky Europe was and how incredibly clean and sanitary by comparison the Aztecs were. And they were able to sustain this for a massive city. At its height, Tenochtitlan had anywhere from 200 to 400,000 inhabitants, making it 5 times the size of London and one of the largest cities anywhere in the world at the time. In order to support this massive city, they built these little farms called chinampas, which were actually floating farms, which solves a lot of irrigation problems. I'm really stressing how impressive this city is, partially just because it's incredibly cool, but also because often native peoples are described as being less advanced than the invading Europeans that they encounter. This really isn't the case. Unfortunately for them, they're going to lack some very essential resources like iron and gunpowder that'll give them a disadvantage in military encounters, but that doesn't mean that they were any less skilled or intelligent than the Europeans. They simply had access to less resources, and this is a really important distinction to make. So I want you to keep this city in mind whenever you're thinking of comparing Native Americans to Europeans. There is one aspect of Aztec society that admittedly doesn't seem great to our modern sensibilities, which is their attitude towards sacrifice. As we've seen, human sacrifice was already a part of the pre-existing Olmec and Mayan cultures, and when the Aztecs arrived, they adopt these religions and go even further with them. Basically, all human societies have practiced human sacrifice at some point in their history. This isn't an anomaly unique to Mesoamerica, but the Aztecs are going to do this on a scale that really isn't seen anywhere else in the world. I put this in brackets because you don't need to know the details in your notes, but just to give you guys a sense of scale, in 1487, at the dedication of a massive pyramid known as the Great Pyramid of the Sun, which you can still see today in Mexico City, in order to sanctify this pyramid, they sacrificed 14,000 people over the course of 4 days. So just continuous sacrifices for 4 days straight. The priests would actually have to tag team out, work in shifts, because their arms were getting tired from all of the sacrifices. So this is a pretty intense religion. In order to sustain the religion, the Aztecs were frequently going to war with their neighbors, and the goal of these wars wasn't to conquer land, which would often be the goal in European battles. Instead, it was to capture people. They specifically targeted other warriors, people who were very physically fit, because they thought those would make the most worthy sacrifices to their gods. And when fighting, Aztec warriors tried to subdue their enemies instead of killing them, because enemies killed on the battlefield were people that they wouldn't be able to sacrifice later in religious ceremonies. This is going to lead to a very different approach to warfare among Aztec warriors than what we'll see from European warriors. It takes a lot of skill to subdue someone without killing them. Stabbing is much easier than tackling and restraining, so the Aztec warriors were extremely highly skilled and had a lot of social status. Warriors were the elites of Aztec society, especially the famous jaguar warriors who would wear jaguar skins to represent their status. These elites formed a professional army, like that was their job, that's what they trained their entire lives for, and with their battle prowess were able to make the Aztec Empire very powerful. They didn't have a very complicated bureaucracy supporting them. After all, the main goal of their conquest was to capture people, not necessarily manage land, and most areas that they conquered were allowed to practice self-rule. Basically, they could keep ruling things for themselves as long as they paid tribute to their Aztec rulers. Despite this self-governance, the people that the Aztecs captured weren't big fans of the Aztecs. After all, they were violently conquered and a lot of their warriors were carted off for sacrifice, which means that when the Spanish do show up and go to war with the Aztec Empire, a lot of the Aztecs' neighbors are going to be willing allies to the Spanish because they really don't like the Aztecs. We'll see how that plays out in our next lesson, but before we talk about that, we need to talk about the powerful South American civilization that the Spanish are also going to encounter. This civilization is going to develop in the Andes Mountains, and it's first going to take shape with a people known as the Chavín. The Chavín are pretty impressive right off the bat because they're farming in some pretty steep mountains, which in and itself is a challenge. They also raise one of my favorite domestic animals, the oh so fun to say llama, and these guys are important because they are the largest domestic animal in America. Other American domestic animals include things like guinea pigs, turkeys, and dogs, but they don't have any really large animals like horses or cows that folks have over in Europe. This is going to be a really important difference because while llamas are great for providing wool and food, they are not a draft animal, meaning they cannot carry people on their backs, their skeletons just aren't built for it, and they are extremely bad-tempered. I'm not sure how many of you guys have had first-hand experience with llamas, but they will scream, spit, bite, kick. You do not want to try to ride a llama. They also aren't strong enough to haul things like wagons, which means a lot of physical labor like hauling heavy loads is going to be handled by humans, whereas over in Europe, people are able to recruit horses and oxen to help them with the task. This is a disadvantage that's going to be important once Europeans arrive. While the Chavan might not have large animals to help them out, they do have some great natural resources, namely gold, and they create a lot of really beautiful golden jewelry. They're also quite good at sculpting and pottery. These are traditions that's going to be carried on by the next empire that rises to power in the region, the Inca Empire. Like the Aztecs, the Inca rise to power at around 1400 CE, and they're going to be the empire in power when the Spanish arrive. If you want a little pop culture reference for one to think of when you think of the Inca, the setting of the Disney movie Emperor's New Groove is heavily based on Incan culture. It's also just a great movie, so if you haven't seen it for a while, I recommend watching it, and if your folks ask, you can tell them that it's for history class. If you're looking for a movie reference for the Aztecs, Road to El Dorado bases their Native American civilization on them. So anyway, the Inca, like the Chavan, they're building their civilization in the Andes Mountains, which in itself is a pretty impressive feat. This is one of the most famous Incan settlements, a place named Machu Picchu, which is just beautiful and gives you a good idea of the level of engineering that the Inca are capable of. Up in these mountains, they're able to set up incredibly successful farms 12,000 feet above sea level. And they're able to do this using a technique called terrace farming, where they basically build steps into the mountains with little tiny fields on each step. They're able to build really advanced irrigation systems within the fields to water the entire area, and the farming techniques that they use are even more effective than farming methods used today, even with all of our advanced machines and chemistry. You don't need to have these numbers in the notes, but I thought it'd be useful to have specific points of comparison. Back during the Incan Empire, they were able to produce 10 tons of potatoes per hectare, compared to modern times where we're generating around 1 to 4 tons. Their main crop is the delicious and nutritious potato. This is where Europeans are going to find out about this magical food. So thank you, Inca. Without you, I would not have tasty French fries to munch on. Their farms being so productive means that they had plenty of extra food, so a lot of people in the Incan Empire could spend their time working on other projects instead of farming. They used this extra labor to conduct some massive building projects. I appreciate this random lady posing for an awkward vacation photo because it gives you an idea of just the scale of some of these stone blocks that the Inca were working with. And remember, they don't have any draft animals, so all of these blocks are being transported using just human labor. The Inca will often frame their buildings around natural landmarks, like you'll often see doorways designed to frame nearby mountains to kind of celebrate the natural beauty around them, and they're able to carve the blocks so precisely that they fit together perfectly. And this is particularly impressive because while the Andes Mountains may be great for growing potatoes, there's not a lot of iron deposits available, meaning the Inca weren't able to make iron tools. The main material they did have to make tools was stone, so they were chipping these rocks into shape using just basic stone tools, and they were still able to get them to fit together so precisely that when I was looking at one of these ruins, the tour guide that was showing us through pulled a knife out, which was a little shocking, and he pointed out that even the thin blade of a pocket knife wasn't able to fit between these stones because they were so tightly fitted. These Incan buildings are so well constructed that a lot of modern cities in Peru still use old Incan walls as part of their homes. That is some really good architecture. Like I mentioned, the Inca don't have any draft animals to help them out with these projects, but they do have the llama. Technically this photo is alpacas, but I think they're cute, so I included them anyway. They're also able to organize these advanced building projects because the Inca are extremely good at math. They invented a device called a quipu, which is a series of knotted strings that, based on how the strings are knotted, they're able to record and calculate numbers on them, even including decimal places, which the concept of decimal numbers tends to be something that it takes humans a long time to come up with. So using decimals is an indicator for a pretty advanced mathematical system. For a long time, historians thought that the Inca actually didn't have any writing system, they just did math, and it was only within the past 2 years that historians realized that some of the knotted patterns on quipu represented letters instead of numbers, so they could also use these knotted strings to help them write. Here's a picture of an actual quipu so you can see just how complicated these could get. Probably a little clunkier than writing things out in pen and paper, but a lot easier to make than manufacturing paper, and a lot easier to transport. And this is important because the Incan Empire was huge. It was very long and skinny, all along the coast of South America, stretching 2,000 miles in length. The Inca were able to sustain a large government bureaucracy to keep this entire thing organized. They also maintained a professional army to keep it well protected and behaving itself, and to make sure the army could get to where it needed to, and that messengers could travel throughout the empire and keep the bureaucracy informed. The Inca created a huge network of roads and suspension bridges spanning the entire length of the empire. And when they needed to send a message, remember they didn't have any horses, so they would use runners, and these runners would operate the way you would a relay race. They'd take the message, run as fast as they could along these roads, and once they'd reached as far as they could run, they'd find a messenger outpost, pass the message on to the next guy, and the next messenger would run as far as he could. This system was so efficient that when the Spanish arrived, these messengers regularly outpaced Spanish horsemen. To make a little connection back to European civilizations, the European empire that was really famous for its roads was Rome. Rome similarly used vast networks of roads to march its army around and maintain its empire. And while the Roman roads were really impressive, they weren't dealing with nearly the same amount of treacherous terrain that the Inca were, because the Inca again are building these roads through mountains. So you'll see them built up on the sides of sheer cliff faces and rope bridges spanning huge chasms. When it came to building transportation networks, the Inca were incredibly capable. In terms of religion, like a lot of civilizations we've run into, the Inca were polytheistic, but their main god was a sun god. This is pretty common because the sun helps bring warmth and growing things to the planet, and most humans recognize that the sun is kind of a big deal. The Inca will practice some human sacrifice like the Aztecs, but they much preferred sacrificing objects and animals to appease the sun god. They also used the religion to support their government. Incan emperors were seen as intermediaries to the gods, sort of a go-between between humans and the sun, and they would continue this role even after death. Incan rulers were routinely mummified, and instead of being buried in pyramids like the Egyptian mummies, their mummies would be carried around the empire as sort of godly representatives. So Incan rulers could remain really important even after their death. In order to secure this important position, Incan rulers had to expand the empire, sort of proving their strength and their divine favor, which means that the Incan Empire, even though it wasn't as human sacrificey as the Aztecs, was constantly conquering its neighbors, which means they're also going to be making some enemies that the Spanish can later turn against them. And the Spanish are going to end up attacking the Inca because one big thing that's distinctive about the Inca is they had so much gold. The Inca were so wealthy that they believed that their emperors should only wear an outfit once, so they deck the emperor out with all of these wonderful gold and jewels and precious feathers and fabrics, and at the end of the day they would burn the entire outfit as a sacrifice to the god, and create a whole new outfit for the next day. Meaning stuff like this was seen as kind of disposable. That's a lot of wealth, but unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, not a lot of practical metals. There's not a lot of iron, and therefore not a lot of steel to be found in the Andes Mountains. And that is going to be a big problem for the Inca and also the Aztecs once the Europeans arrive. We'll learn about how that whole mess goes down in our next lesson, but for now, take a moment to fill out this section of your exit ticket and give yourself a 5-minute break before moving on.